Escorts, have you ever found love with a client? Story 1. During my brief time working as an escort, I found myself in a situation that caught me completely off guard. One night, a man approached me while I was on stage, tipping me generously, but persistently asking for my number. His behavior was off-putting, and I tried to brush him off as politely as I could. Just as I managed to get him to leave me alone, another man stepped out of his booth, threw $20 at me, and praised me for how I handled the situation. After my set, I sat down with this new man to thank him. To my surprise, we struck up a conversation that felt natural and effortless. We discovered a shared love for anime, and from that moment on, he would come by whenever I was working. He wasn't like other clients. He never asked for lap dances or private sessions. All he wanted was to talk and spend time together. Our connection grew deeper over time. I was in a dark place, surrounded by people who didn't really care about me. One day, out of the blue, I texted him asking if he wanted to hang out outside of work. He was thrilled, and according to some of the other dancers, he would check in every weekend to see if I was around. If I wasn't, he'd leave without seeing anyone else. Eventually, our friendship turned into something more. We started spending time together outside the club, and it wasn't long before we became a couple. It felt like a dream, something straight out of a romance movie. We never hid how we met, but we didn't broadcast it either. Our close friends knew the truth, and they supported us. Today, we're still together, and I often think back to that strange night when everything changed. Story 2. During my time as a stripper, I never expected to develop feelings for someone I worked with, let alone the manager of the club. He was the kind of guy who always had the girls' attention. They would leave tips on stage, hoping he would bring them back to the dressing room for some flirting. I saw it happen all the time, but I never thought much of it. At the time, I was dealing with chronic pain and struggling with an eating disorder. It felt like my life was spiraling out of control, but somehow he always noticed when I was having a rough day. He never pushed me or tried to take advantage of the situation. Instead, he genuinely cared about how I was doing and went out of his way to help. Despite trying to ignore my feelings, I found myself falling for him. He was kind, attentive, and he made me feel valued in a world where I often felt invisible. It wasn't long before our professional relationship turned into something more. 15 years later, we're still together. We've built a life together, have 3 beautiful children, and I can't imagine my life without him. Sometimes I think back to those early days at the club and marvel at how far we've come. What started as a job I took to make ends meet turned into the best decision I ever made because it led me to him. Story 3. From the other side of things, I was once in a relationship with a sex worker, and it was one of the most meaningful connections I've ever had. We met in the way you'd expect, but from the very beginning, I could tell she was different. There was an authenticity to her that I hadn't encountered before, and that quickly drew me in. Over time, our relationship deepened. It wasn't just about the transactions. We became real friends. She helped me with various aspects of my life, like getting my apartment set up and other personal matters. I began to hope that our relationship was evolving into something beyond the usual client-worker dynamic, but I was cautious not to push too hard. One day, after we'd spent more time together, she didn't take the money I left for her. When I pointed it out, she got upset and essentially told me I was blind not to realize she had developed feelings for me too. It was a surprising and touching moment that solidified the bond we had been building. We were together for a little over a year, and even after we broke up, we stayed friends. That was over a decade ago, and we've kept in touch ever since. We've even gone on holidays together, and she's visited me at home a few times. She's now moved back to her home country, running a successful business, and is engaged to a great guy. I'm truly happy for her, and I'll always treasure the connection we shared. Story 4. When I turned 18, I found myself entangled in a relationship with a 60-year-old doctor. I was struggling financially, so the gifts, money, dinners, and vacations he lavished on me were more than enough to make me fall for him. It felt like a whirlwind romance where every day was an exciting new adventure planned by Lonnie. Let's call him that. For a while, I was completely consumed by thoughts of him and the extravagant life he offered me, but then, out of the blue, he called me and told me we couldn't see each other anymore. The reason? He'd developed feelings for me, and because of that, he felt it was best to move on to another girl, someone he wouldn't fall in love with. Hearing that shattered me. I was utterly heartbroken and slipped into a deep depression. The emotional pain was overwhelming, and it took me a long time to recover from it. Ironically, some of the money he had given me went towards therapy, which eventually actually helped me to heal and move on with my life. Story 5. A friend of mine had a sister and her best friend who were both working as sex workers. They were close, almost inseparable, until they both fell in love with the same client. It became a complicated mess, with both of them vying for his attention. The guy, let's call him Jack, was charming, wealthy, and knew how to make them feel special. Neither of the women wanted to admit to the other that they were in love with Jack, but it didn't take long before their feelings started to surface. They began distancing themselves from each other, their once strong friendship deteriorating into jealousy and resentment. Eventually, they both confessed their love for Jack, hoping that he would choose one of them, but instead, Jack, who had a wife and family, decided to cut ties with both women to avoid further complications in his life. He told them that he couldn't give them what they wanted and that he needed to focus on his family. The whole situation left both women devastated. They had lost not only the man they loved, but also their closest friend. It took a long time for them to recover from the emotional turmoil, and although they tried to repair their friendship, things were never quite the same again. Story 6. I used to work as an escort, and over time, you get used to the routine. Clients come and go, and you learn to keep your distance emotionally. But one client changed everything for me. He wasn't like the others. He was quiet, kind, and never treated me like an object. We'd spend hours just talking, and sometimes I felt like he was the only person who saw me for who I really was, beyond the job. He'd book me regularly, but it never felt like work. I found myself looking forward to our meetings, not because of the money, but because I genuinely enjoyed his company. He would always bring a book with him, something he thought I might like, and we'd discuss it over wine. It was our little tradition, and it felt intimate. One evening, after a few glasses of wine, he admitted that he was falling in love with me. My heart raced because I realized I felt the same way, but I was terrified. I knew this world. I knew how these things usually ended. Love wasn't supposed to happen in this line of work. But there we were, two people caught up in something neither of us had planned for. Against my better judgment, I let myself fall for him. We started seeing each other outside of work, and for a while, it was like living in a dream, but reality caught up with us. The lines between client and lover blurred, and soon, the pressures of my job and the secrecy it required started to take their toll on our relationship. Eventually, it became too much. We had to face the truth that what we had wasn't sustainable. I couldn't give up my job, and he couldn't live with the constant uncertainty. We parted ways, both heartbroken, but knowing it was for the best. To this day, I still think about him. Sometimes I wonder what could have been if we had met under different circumstances, but I also know that the love we shared, however brief, was real, and that's something I'll always cherish. Story 7. During my years as an escort, I always kept my emotions in check. It was a job, nothing more, and I knew how to keep my heart guarded, but that all changed when I met him. He was unlike any other client, gentle, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in me as a person. Our meetings started off as business, but they quickly evolved into something more. He wasn't flashy or overly confident, but he had a quiet strength that drew me in. Each time we met, he'd ask about my day, about my life, and actually listen to what I had to say. It was refreshing, and before I knew it, I found myself looking forward to our time together. Not because of the money, but because of him. We spent hours just talking, sharing stories about our lives, our dreams, and our fears. He was the first client who made me feel seen, like I wasn't just an object, but a real person with thoughts and feelings. Slowly, my professional detachment began to crumble, and I realized I was falling for him. One evening, after a particularly heartfelt conversation, he told me he was in love with me. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I shouldn't let this happen, but the truth was, I had fallen for him too. We both knew it was complicated, that our relationship was built on a foundation that wasn't meant to last, but we decided to give it a shot anyway. For a few months, we tried to make it work. We'd meet outside of our usual arrangement, going on dates like a regular couple. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, but I couldn't help myself. I wanted to see where this could go, but as time went on, the reality of our situation became harder to ignore. My job wasn't something he could fully accept, and I couldn't leave it behind. The secrecy, the guilt, and the constant fear of being found out began to weigh on us. We had long talks about our future, but deep down, we both knew it was only a matter of time before it all fell apart. In the end, we decided to end things before we hurt each other any more than we already had. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, and it left a hole in my heart that took a long time to heal. But I knew it was the right choice. We were from two different worlds, and as much as we wanted to be together, we couldn't make it work. Even now, years later, I think about him sometimes. I wonder what might have happened if things had been different. But I also know that what we had was special, even if it was fleeting. It was a love that wasn't meant to be, but it was real, and I'll always carry that with me.